This story starts with a claim that sounds dramatic, almost cinematic. California's supply chains are breaking down, retail shelves are at risk, and the governor is supposedly alarmed, even panicked. You've seen the headlines, the clips, the thumbnails, truckers saying they're done, stores supposedly closing because goods aren't arriving. A sense that something fundamental has snapped in the largest state economy in the United States. But before we accept that framing, we need to slow down and separate three very different things that are being mashed together: real economic stress, structural weaknesses that have existed for years, and a layer of viral exaggeration that thrives on anxiety. Here's the first hard fact. There is no major verified reporting from outlets like Reuters, AP, Bloomberg, or the Financial Times saying that California's retail sector is experiencing a sudden catastrophic supply chain collapse right now. No confirmation of empty shelves statewide. No official declaration of emergency from the governor's office. That matters because if something truly systemic were breaking, the big wires would be all over it. They aren't. So when people say the governor is alarmed, what they're usually pointing to is tone, implication, or selective remarks taken out of a much more technical context. At the same time, dismissing the whole story as fake would also be wrong. California does have real, documented supply vulnerabilities, and they hit retail indirectly but powerfully. Energy is a good example. Refinery capacity in the state has been shrinking, not expanding. When a major refinery idles or closes, California can't simply flip a switch and replace that supply locally. The state relies on imports of specialized fuel blends, which means longer supply lines, higher transport costs, and more exposure to disruption. That doesn't mean shelves go empty tomorrow. It means costs rise, margins tighten, and retailers feel pressure in ways consumers don't always immediately see. Now layer on top of that the broader logistics environment. California's ports handle an enormous share of U.S. imports, especially from Asia. That makes the state a gateway, but also a choke point. Any friction, labor disputes, regulatory delays, trucking shortages ripples outward. Retailers don't experience this as a single dramatic event. They experience it as chronic uncertainty. Shipments arriving late, transport costing more, inventories needing to be managed more aggressively. This is not collapse, it's stress. But stress is exactly the condition in which panic narratives flourish. And that's where the viral economy comes in. Social media rewards certainty, not nuance. Everything is fine but fragile doesn't get clicks. California is falling apart does. So a video of one struggling trucker becomes proof of a statewide exodus. A store closure driven by theft, rent, or corporate restructuring becomes evidence of a supply chain breakdown. The incentives are obvious. Content creators gain attention. Political actors gain ammunition. Anxiety fills the gaps where careful reporting would normally sit. So where does the governor fit into this? Not as a figure wringing his hands in fear, but as a political manager navigating conflicting pressures. On one side, environmental commitments, labor alliances, and regulatory frameworks that are central to California's political identity. On the other, businesses, retailers, and consumers who experience those same policies as costs, delays, and constraints. When state officials talk about monitoring supply or ensuring continuity, that's not panic. That's bureaucratic language for risk management in a complex system that everyone knows is tight. The key point is this: what people are reacting to is not a single breakdown, but the feeling that the system has less slack than it used to, fewer buffers, less redundancy. When something goes wrong, fuel, trucking, port throughput, it shows up faster and hurts more. Retail is where all of this becomes visible because retail is downstream. It's the last stop before the consumer. By the time stress reaches the store, the causes are already buried several layers back. So the real question isn't, is California collapsing right now? It's why the state's supply chains feel so brittle, why small disruptions generate such big reactions, and who benefits from framing that brittleness as either a crisis or a non-issue. Because once you understand that, you can start to see the underlying mechanisms. And that's where this story actually gets interesting and more uncomfortable in the next part. To understand why California keeps finding itself at the center of these supply chain anxieties, you have to stop thinking in slogans and start thinking in mechanisms. A supply chain is not a vibe. It's a sequence of dependencies. Goods don't magically appear on shelves. They move from factories to ports, from ports to trucks or rail, from warehouses to stores. Every step assumes the next step will function on time, at a predictable cost, under rules that don't suddenly change. When that assumption breaks down, even slightly, the whole system tightens. California is uniquely exposed because it sits at multiple choke points at once. It's not just a consumer market, it's a logistical hub. The ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach handle a massive share of U.S. container traffic. That means California doesn't just depend on supply chains, it is the supply chain for much of the country. When congestion builds, or labor negotiations drag on, or regulatory requirements slow throughput, the effects aren't abstract. Containers stack up, truck turn times increase, costs rise, retailers downstream pay for that in higher freight bills and less reliable delivery schedules. Then there's trucking, which is the connective tissue between ports, warehouses, and stores. Trucking looks simple from the outside, but it's one of the most policy-sensitive sectors in the economy. Driver availability, licensing rules, emission standards, insurance costs, and fuel prices all interact. California has stricter emissions regulations than most states. Those rules have environmental logic, but they also shrink the pool of compliant trucks and raise capital costs for operators. Large fleets can absorb that. Independent truckers often can't. When independents exit, capacity tightens. Tight capacity means higher rates. Higher rates mean retailers either raise prices or accept thinner margins. Fuel is another quiet but central lever. Transportation runs on energy, and California's fuel market is unusually constrained. The state uses specialized fuel blends, which limits where supply can come from. As in-state refining capacity declines, reliance on imports grows. Imports mean longer supply lines and exposure to global volatility. A disruption that might be minor elsewhere, say a shipping delay or refinery maintenance, hits harder when there are fewer alternative suppliers. Retailers don't see this as an energy policy issue. They see it as transport invoices that suddenly don't pencil out the way they used to. Warehousing adds another layer. California has enormous warehouse infrastructure, especially in the Inland Empire, but it's under pressure. Land costs are high. Labor costs are high. Local opposition to warehouse expansion is growing. That limits flexibility. In a looser system, retailers could overstock when times are good and draw down inventory when logistics tighten. In a tighter system, inventories are lean by necessity. Lean systems are efficient when everything works. They are fragile when it doesn't. Put all of this together and you get a system that is not broken, but stressed in very specific ways. And stress is unevenly distributed. Big retailers with sophisticated logistics networks, long-term shipping contracts, and pricing power can navigate it. Smaller retailers can't. They live shipment to shipment. A delay that a big chain absorbs becomes an existential threat to a small business. That's why the retail sector is not a single thing. It's a hierarchy. and supply chain stress widens the gap between the top and the bottom. This is the backdrop against which all those alarmist claims spread. People sense that the system is tighter, less forgiving, more expensive. They're not wrong about that feeling. But feelings don't explain causes. The cause isn't one bad decision or one incompetent official. It's a structure where efficiency has been maximized, buffers have been stripped out, and policy choices stack constraints on top of markets that were already fragile. Once you see that, the next question becomes unavoidable. How political leadership responds to this kind of structural stress, and whose interests that response actually serves. That's where the governor enters the picture more clearly in the next part. When people say the governor is alarmed, what they usually mean is that Gavin Newsom is being forced to talk about supply, logistics, and continuity, topics politicians prefer to keep invisible. That alone tells you something. Supply chains only become political when they stop working smoothly, or when enough powerful actors start worrying that they might not. But alarm is not the same thing as panic, and understanding Newsom's position requires looking at the incentives he's balancing, not the tone of a headline or a viral clip. Start with the basic constraint. California's political economy is built on a dense web of regulations, alliances, and long-term commitments. Environmental standards, labor protections, and climate goals are not side projects. They are core to the state's governing coalition. Newsom didn't inherit those priorities accidentally, and he can't abandon them casually. At the same time, the state's economy depends on goods moving cheaply and predictably. Retail doesn't care about ideological coherence. It cares about trucks arriving on time and costs staying within range. That's the tension, and it's structural, not personal. So when refinery capacity tightens and the state leans more heavily on fuel imports, Newsom's response isn't to declare a crisis. It's to signal continuity, keep supply flowing, reassure markets, emphasize that arrangements are in place. That's not because everything is fine, but because markets react badly to uncertainty. A governor who sounds panicked creates the very instability he's trying to prevent. In that sense, the calm language is strategic. It's about managing expectations, not denying problems. At the same time, Newsom is under pressure from multiple directions. Business groups warn that costs are becoming unmanageable. Logistics operators complain about regulatory friction. Retailers quietly lobby for relief, flexibility, or exemptions. On the other side, environmental groups and labor organizations resist any move that looks like rollback. Newsom's job is not to solve the supply chain in some abstract sense. It's to keep this coalition intact while preventing visible economic breakdowns that could turn into political disasters. That's why the loudest claims about collapse don't come from inside the State House. They come from outside actors who benefit from framing California as a cautionary tale. Conservative media, anti-regulatory advocates, and political rivals have every incentive to present logistical stress as proof of failure. See, the argument goes, this is what happens when regulation goes too far. That framing ignores the fact that many of these supply chain pressures, global shipping volatility, energy market shifts, labor shortages, exist nationwide. California just experiences them more intensely because it's bigger, more regulated, and more exposed. But there's another incentive at work, and it's more subtle. Downplaying risk also serves powerful interests. Large corporations with deep logistics capacity benefit from a system that squeezes smaller competitors. When supply chains tighten, scale becomes an advantage. Big retailers can negotiate contracts, absorb higher costs, and wait out disruptions. Small retailers can't. So there's a strange convergence. Critics exaggerate collapse to score political points, while incumbents minimize stress because the stress quietly consolidates their market power. Newsom sits in the middle of that contradiction. If he amplifies alarm, he feeds a narrative of mismanagement. If he dismisses concern, he alienates businesses and consumers who feel the squeeze. So the response becomes technocratic, incremental, and carefully worded. Monitor the situation. Coordinate with suppliers. Signal stability. Avoid big gestures. From a political survival standpoint, this makes sense. From a systemic standpoint, it leaves the underlying brittleness untouched. And that's the real issue. The question isn't whether the governor is scared. It's whether the structure he governs is becoming less resilient over time, and whether the current political incentives allow anyone in power to address that honestly. Because once you shift your focus from personalities to outcomes, a harder truth comes into view. Supply chain stress doesn't hit everyone equally. It creates winners and losers. And in California's retail economy, those divisions are already widening. That's what we need to look at next. Once you stop asking, is there a collapse, and start asking, who absorbs the stress, the picture sharpens quickly. Supply chain strain is not evenly shared. It redistributes power. It quietly sorts winners from losers, often without any dramatic announcement. And California's retail sector is a clear example of how that sorting works. Start with the winners. Large retailers, national chains, big box stores, vertically integrated operations are structurally advantaged in a tight supply environment. They have long-term shipping contracts, dedicated logistics teams, and the capital to ride out volatility. If transport costs rise, they spread those costs across thousands of stores. If a shipment is delayed, they shift inventory from another region. If regulations tighten, they hire compliance staff instead of exiting the market. Stress for them is a barrier to entry. It keeps smaller competitors from catching up. Energy and logistics intermediaries can also benefit. When supply tightens, prices rise. When prices rise, margins can widen for firms positioned to move scarce goods. Importers, specialized fuel suppliers, and large freight operators with compliant fleets gain leverage. They become indispensable. Retailers don't negotiate from a position of strength when alternatives disappear. This is a classic crisis dynamic. Scarcity concentrates power in the hands of those who control choke points. Now look at the losers. Independent truckers are high on the list. They operate on thin margins and limited flexibility. Higher fuel prices, stricter emissions rules, insurance costs, and licensing complications hit them first and hardest. When they exit, they don't get replaced one for one by new entrants. Capacity shrinks. That loss of capacity doesn't make headlines, but it raises rates for everyone else. And those higher rates eventually land on retailers who don't have negotiating power. Small and mid-sized retailers are the next layer down. They don't control ports, they don't control trucks, they don't control fuel costs. They depend on predictable delivery schedules and manageable transport prices. When those assumptions break, even temporarily, cash flow becomes a problem. Inventory arrives late. Shelves don't turn over as expected. Credit tightens. Some stores close, not because there are no goods in the world, but because the path between goods and storefront has become too expensive or unreliable for them to survive. Workers occupy a more complicated position. Unionized labor in ports and warehouses often has job security and bargaining power, especially in a tight labor market. Informal or independent workers, owner-operator truckers, subcontracted warehouse labor have far less protection. Policy choices that strengthen one group can inadvertently squeeze another. The result isn't justice or injustice in the abstract, it's redistribution. The system decides who gets stability and who absorbs volatility. And then there are consumers who experience all of this indirectly. They don't see supply chain diagrams. They see prices. They see occasional shortages. They feel uncertainty. Even when shelves are stocked, higher costs show up at the register. That fuels anger and suspicion. People don't blame logistics optimization. They blame whoever is most visible, the store, the state, the governor. That political pressure is real, even if the causal chain is long and messy. What's important here is that none of this requires a dramatic breakdown to be consequential. You don't need empty shelves everywhere to reshape an economy. You just need sustained pressure in a system with unequal buffers. Over time, that pressure consolidates markets, eliminates small players, and hardens the dominance of large firms that can survive volatility. In that sense, supply chain stress is not just a logistical issue. It's a competitive strategy enforced by circumstance and policy. This is why calming language from officials and alarmist language from critics both miss the point. The system is working for some. It's failing for others. And the longer that imbalance persists, the more permanent it becomes. Which leads to the final question. If this isn't a sudden crisis, but a slow structural shift, what comes next, and what choices actually remain on the table? That's where the story has to end. Once you see California's supply chain story as a slow structural shift rather than a sudden collapse, the future looks less dramatic and more troubling. Systems like this don't usually break all at once. They harden, they lock in patterns, and those patterns become harder to reverse the longer they're treated as temporary stress instead of permanent change. Zoom out and you see that California is not unique in facing supply chain volatility. Global shipping is still shaped by geopolitical risk, energy transitions, and fragile labor markets. What makes California stand out is that it experiences all of this at higher intensity. It is more exposed to global trade, more dependent on regulation-heavy logistics, and more politically constrained in how it can respond. That combination limits the menu of realistic policy options, regardless of who is in the governor's office. One option is deregulation, or at least selective relaxation. In theory, easing certain rules could expand trucking capacity, lower costs, and add slack back into the system. In practice, this collides directly with the state's environmental and labor commitments. Those commitments are not symbolic, they are institutional. Rolling them back would fracture the governing coalition and trigger legal and political battles that could take years. Even partial deregulation tends to be temporary, narrow, and fiercely contested. That means it's unlikely to provide durable relief. Another option is public investment. Expand port capacity, modernize infrastructure, support alternative fuels or rail to reduce pressure on trucking. These are long-term fixes, and they make sense on paper. But they don't address short-term pain, and they require massive coordination, funding, and time. Retailers struggling today don't benefit from a port upgrade that comes online in a decade. Politically, long timelines dilute accountability. No single administration gets credit, and the costs are immediate. Then there's the market-driven path, which is what we're mostly on now. Firms adapt or exit. Large players consolidate. Supply chains become more centralized, more automated, and more capital-intensive. This path doesn't require new legislation or bold speeches. It just unfolds. From a purely economic standpoint, it's efficient. From a social standpoint, it's destabilizing. Fewer independent operators, fewer small retailers. More dependence on a handful of dominant firms that can absorb shocks and pass costs downstream. This is the path that calming rhetoric quietly enables. By framing the situation as manageable, leaders avoid panic but also avoid intervention. That's not incompetence, it's incentive driven behavior. Politicians respond to visible crises, not slow restructurings. As long as shelves are mostly stocked and unemployment doesn't spike, the system is deemed functional. The fact that it's becoming more unequal, more brittle for small players, and more expensive for consumers doesn't trigger emergency powers or sweeping reform. So, where does that leave the narrative about an alarmed governor and a retail supply chain breakdown? Somewhere between exaggeration and denial. There is no sudden implosion, but there is a narrowing corridor of stability where fewer actors can survive without scale, capital, and political access. That's not a talking point. It's an outcome of incentives layered over time. The real risk is not that California wakes up one morning with empty shelves everywhere. The real risk is that year by year, the retail economy becomes less diverse, less resilient, and more dependent on a small number of logistics and retail giants. When that happens, the next disruption, whether energy, labor, or geopolitics, hits harder because there's nowhere else for the shock to go. That's the conclusion most headlines won't give you. Not collapse, not reassurance, but consolidation under stress. And once you see that clearly, the story stops being about alarm and starts being about power, structure, and the choices that quietly shape an economy long before anything actually breaks.